Good morning, everyone. Let's see. Senator Clarkson, are you off your phone call?
We're just finishing it.
Okay. I'll give you another minute or two. Okay. Everybody, thank you for your patience. We ran over.
Done, but I haven't done the stairs or my jumping jacks.
I'm sorry. You have to
Yeah.
wait till 10:30.
Yeah, I know.
Okay. Um,
But it
okay.
was, yeah,
We are
great.
we are back. We are live. So I'm gonna suggest we're back on S33 mini TIFs. And really, my hope is that we can plow through our witnesses this morning, and maybe as early as uh, tomorrow or next week, we can decide if we're going forward with this and in what fashion. I don't want to have this language. It probably has to make a stop in finance. Um, so,
Uh, uh,
uh,
Mr.
Senator
Chair,
Clarkson.
I know that there are a couple witnesses who would like to weigh in, particularly VNRC, I know would like to weigh in, and I'm sure there are one or two other planners who might. So it would be helpful if we had at least one other time for testimony on this.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Um, I I appreciate hearing that. I'm somewhat dependent upon some of these groups reaching out when they see this on the schedule, asking to
Yes.
testify, and it may have passed me, but uh, obviously anybody who wants to testify before we make any decisions should have the right to testify. Um, I'd like to start off with uh, Graham. We heard a lot of references from the auditor on workup and studies that have been done on VEPSI in general. And I don't want to take a lot of your time, Graham, but I want to know what reports are out there, the gist of what they say, and how they apply to a much smaller version here and the potential. I know you've done some workup and reviewed some of the discussion in finance last year on this bill. Um, what the potential impact JFO sees on the trust on property taxes and the ed fund.
Yeah, sure. So I can speak to some of those. I've also prepared some testimony for the committee that's posted on the committee's website. My name is Graham Campbell. I work at the Joint Fiscal Office, and I can't speak to exactly what reports the state auditor is referring to. I authored the 2018 tax increment financing report, and that was on the general TIF program. So it's obviously tangentially related to this. And the main findings of that report were largely that Vermont's TIF program relative to other TIF programs in the country is well run and well defined within statute that helps limit the sort of downsides to traditional tax increment financing that you see around the country. The second was we thought that it could be generating some economic benefits, but it would be kind of largely location specific. And then we get into a lot of questions about whether these would have occurred otherwise. And we didn't come down completely on whether we thought these would occur otherwise. We thought it kind of depended upon where they were located. And the third major finding was that we found that the TIF program, using a sort of alternative way of measuring the fiscal impact, was costing the ed fund about $3 to $6 million per year over the next 5 years. And the way we did that analysis was we sort of made an assumption about what would have occurred otherwise, which was largely based upon what the average county growth rate in the area where the TIF district occurred, its sort of background grand list growth rate was. So we subtracted that out when we were calculating the overall increment, and we sort of came up with the fiscal estimate that way.
So
And so, yeah.
can I ask you a question on that? Just so I'm grounded, maybe other people are grounded. So that $3 to $6 million loss to the ed fund on an annual basis, is that offset in the long term by increased benefits to the ed fund?
Offset, you mean once the TIF district is no longer functioning?
Right, once it's
I-
absorbed into the grand list. I mean, the assumption that most of this is based on is that there's a great leap in the grand list value as a result of this.
Right. The tax expenditure slash fiscal impact, whatever we want to call it, is based upon the idea that you have growth in the property values of the properties within the district, but the ed fund does not receive the full portion of that. They receive 25 to 30%, or depending on what the district is. And so that's the idea of the tax expenditure. And the question about whether this offsets in the long run, I think also circles back to the idea of whether this would have happened anyway without the TIF district. Because I'm sure if you spoke to Tom Cavett, the legislative economist, he would say that it's never offset because that development would have occurred otherwise, and you've spent the money through the ed fund for those 20 years, and then you're essentially sacrificing that 20 years of revenue for the ed fund to get to the end of the TIF district with that big bump in property value growth. What we did in our analysis is we allowed for the idea that some of this might have not occurred without the TIF district, but we just sort of said that what would have occurred absent the TIF district was basically what had been happening over the past 20 years in the town where it was, the property value growth. And so in effect, what we did was shave out that property value growth. So rather than assuming a flat taxable base like you have to do to calculate tax increments, we assume that taxable value would increase by the background growth rate that existed in the county. And that's how we arrive at sort of a different estimate than what you see. So you see lots of different estimates around TIF, the cost for tax increment financing. On the one hand, you have what I have to present to the emergency board every January, which is what we call the maximum tax impact on the education fund. And that is assuming that none of this would have happened, or all of this would have happened without the use of TIF. And so whatever the property value growth is, whatever the increment is, the 70 or 75% that is not going to the ed fund, that's the cost, the ed fund. Ours was in the middle where we said, okay, well, some of this is likely happening because of TIF, and we shave out the portion that we think would have otherwise happened without the TIF. And so that's why we arrive at a slightly smaller number. And then I think on the other end, you have those who believe that none of this would have happened anyway, and then therefore any sort of money that goes to the education fund, or TIF, does not essentially end up being a cost to the education fund, because if you didn't have TIF, then you'd have no growth in the grand list. So, I think in general, over the years, myself looking at TIF, I try not to focus so much on the cost to the ed fund, because it's, what you believe the cost of the ed fund is depends upon where you stand on the but-for analysis. And so, my look at TIF, it more goes down past the sort of cost of the ed fund into the sort of organization, the administration, and the complexity of TIF, rather than looking at whether this would have happened otherwise, because it's largely an unprovable point for an analyst like myself to make the case that either all of this or some of this. I think it varies by district. So I found that the discussion gets sort of buried in there, rather than my discussion that I prepared today is more on the administration, the theoretical, things the legislators should consider when talking about TIF, rather than what the impact would be. And I don't have an estimate for you today of what S33 would cost the ed fund. I just don't know, because I don't know what the size of the districts will be. I don't have an idea of the size of the property developments, the private developments that will happen around these projects. I don't know. I know that it's limited to a number, just 6 projects, but I don't know where those projects are going to be. So it's really hard for me to tell you, what this will cost the ed fund.
So you've preempted my next question, because I was going to ask you precisely that. But with assumptions, I mean, I think where there's been uniform criticism of what we did last year about the size of uh, the, I guess, the loans here are the size of the projects of being $1.5 million each. But using what S33 has in it, I'm just trying to get, I mean, I guess if you approach this, that this legislature, or this state has accepted at least tips to the extent they're out there with 10 or so districts already. And what this bill is trying to do is extend that creative financing to towns that can't afford to go that route because of its complexity. I'm just trying to what I'm trying to understand is S33, how does it compare in size to what is out there already? So if there's a TIF district that has $200 million in Burlington, what, and maybe this is a better question for Megan, what's the size of all the TIF districts so far? And what are we opening the door here to? It seems like it's very tiny compared to what we've already done. I'm just trying to get some grounding in the size of this. It's almost like a pilot project for a few years, 2 a year for 3 or 5 years. I can't remember, with a cap of 1.5 million on any individual project. So it seems like it's bug dust almost compared to what we already allowed.
I think that's a safe characterization of this program. What, I don't know. That's one of the things I bring up in the document I prepared is we don't know from this bill how big the districts themselves will be. But I think it's a fair assumption to say that the size of these districts, both in terms of the number of parcels, but the sort of value of the parcels within them would be significantly smaller than the current TIP program.
Doesn't S33 cap the size of state involvement in these at 1.5 per district?
The maximum debt ceiling for a project is 1.5 million. So you're right. The amount of debt being in these districts will be, or I guess in this sort of mini project base, is significantly smaller than the current TIF districts. I don't know the exact numbers for every single one of these, but I know St. Albans TIF district has at least $15 million worth of debt associated with it. I think the Burlington one is significantly higher than that. So yes, these are much smaller than the typical tax increment financing district. And that's because in the current TIP program, there are multiple projects that are being done,
Right. Right.
and larger projects. And so
except in, do we, I'm trying to remember, do we, in our legislation, when we established TIF districts in St. Albans and Burlington, do we put limits on those, or once you establish a TIF district, they can borrow essentially against the ed fund for however much they want?
Well, I don't think there's a cap on the amount of debt for a TIF district. They have to go to their voters and ask them to do this. So I think that's an artificial, or a cap that's not legislatively put in place. There's the current statute, I don't believe, has a cap on the amount of debt that a district can take out. So they can take out that debt over the course of 5 or 10 years if they receive an extension from BEPC, but they're capped at the amount of time they can retain education tax increment at 20 years. And so, it's sort of a planning process for the municipality to come up with, okay, how much increment do you think we're going to generate from this district? How much do we think we can generate from a certain amount of borrowing and infrastructure investment? And so I don't think it's in the municipality's best interest to just essentially take out a humongous amount of debt without, looking at the potential private development that would come along with it.
Okay, so I'm going to let you go on to the presentation you had prepared, but just to end that conversation, even though existing TIF districts are not necessarily capped other than by what the voters will deal with, this particular bill does cap these new mini districts, right, as to how much they can borrow using the ed fund financing.
Yeah, so I just want to clarify that this is a borrowing cap, and that you're not borrowing from the ed fund. You're using ed fund tax increment to pay back the debt, and so there is a cap on the amount that a municipality can borrow under this program. And so
Okay.
I think there is
my wording wouldn't may have been off, but there is a cap, is what I'm saying, in this program.
yes,
as
in
opposed
SR 33, as I read, it's $1.5 million.
Right. Okay. Okay. Do you want to go on and briefly educate us on the concerns administratively and other things you were going to talk about in your? I'm sorry. Did you submit prepared testimony? If you did, I
Yeah,
apologize.
it's on our website.
Okay. So why don't you just run through that quickly?
Okay. I prepared a document. It's on the committee's website, and this is, and I'm not going to run through the background because I think the committee has a good understanding of this bill. Essentially, I'm just listing out some of the pros and cons and then other questions I had about the bill. Having as someone who's spent quite a bit of time on TIF, and I just wanted to highlight. So the pros that I see for this program are sort of the same as the regular TIF program, I think. And with the sort of added benefit that some municipalities are small and they can't really access the current TIF program. So that's an obvious benefit. But the current TIF program and this program kind of encourages development in village centers, and that encourages denser development within village centers, and that has been shown to have a lot of positive economic benefits. So driving your development into downtowns is unambiguously a good thing. And I think because TIF requires that, it is sort of, getting those benefits. And I think that's something that would come here. The second is what I heard a lot of when I wrote the report a couple of years ago was this municipal skin in the game theory. And the idea is that since TIF is a relatively complex economic development tool relative to, say, a grant, it requires robust planning. It requires a town to take stock of all the parcels it has and have a good sense of what development is going to happen. And it requires a sort of strategy around development. And this sort of proactivity on the part of the municipalities is, seen as a good thing. That TIF is something that, drives that more than just sort of maybe a typical grant program. And the third is the sort of revenue certainty for municipalities. When you get a TIF district and you set up a TIF district, you're guaranteed education fund tax increment for 20 years. There's no state program that guarantees that type of certainty. If you have a grant program that's subject to an appropriation, it could be subject to budget constraints every single year. So once you get your TIF district set up, you have essentially 20 years of guaranteed financing for your project, or money available to pay for debt service. And then there's the point that I made sort of going into this, that some municipalities, because they're so small, might not be able to bear the cost of improvement through traditional user fees. That's a lot of small municipalities, when they're building wastewater treatment plants or have wastewater treatment plants, finance those or pay for the operations of them with user fees. And you might not be able to, do larger capital expenditures based upon those user fees. So that's a potential. Those are the pros I see in this program. As someone who's looked at TIF, I would say that it's difficult to know exactly what the pros are on these, because I haven't seen any program in any other state that has a TIF program that would be like this. There are lots of states that will use tax increment financing to build a specific project, but the district is very large and it's typically a very large project. So think like a downtown sports arena. They'll use TIF. And in other states you can give money directly to a private developer, and then they'll establish a TIF district around the entire downtown area to help pay for the arena. But I haven't seen anything in any other state where you have, as small of a program designed for such a limited purpose as this. So it's difficult for me to fully grasp what the potential pros would be, because I just haven't seen it happen in other states. And so I would say, I don't know if that's a con or not, but I haven't seen a program like this operate in any other state. I think that the concept of project-based TIFs carry all the general risks that tax increment financing, brings in general. So, the big one here is, what if your increment doesn't come up with doesn't meet your projections? You take out 1.5 million in debt, but then the private development doesn't actually come. Then you're sort of on the hook. You're sort of, what do you do? The second is that TIF's a pretty complex tool for economic development financing, and it's almost always subject to legislative changes every year, and you have sort of carve outs within the statute. It's just relatively hard to follow the rules, and I don't blame municipalities for that. But you see that when the state auditor goes to some of these TIF districts and finds issues. He hasn't found issues in all of them, but you see towns that were trying to do the right thing, but because of the complexity of TIF, they've sort of stumbled, and it's either resulted in them having to pay back education fund, or go back for significant or for substantial change requests to BEPC. And the third is the long time horizon that TIF has. It's a 20-year program, essentially, once you establish the TIF district. And that just opens the door for stuff like recessions and other events like pandemics that can really have a major impact on building and your long-term plans, and therefore your cash flow. We saw last year that, all the districts came in asking for a 1-year extension of their debt borrowing period because of the pandemic. We saw Hartford come in last year saying we needed 3 more years because of the recession happening in 2013-14. And that's the sort of thing you open the door to when you're talking a 20-year period. Nothing is certain over 20 years. It's very difficult to predict, how much revenue you're going to have, what's going to come up, how much building you're going to have, and you're always going to run into these issues. And that's something you introduce when you have such a long time horizon for a program like this. The second major point that I want to bring up is, I think capacity issues are a big thing to highlight for this program. In smaller towns, just don't have as much capacity. A town like Thetford is not going to have the same number of people working on their tax increment financing district as the city of Burlington or South Burlington. And again, I would emphasize this is not a simple economic development tool. It requires a lot of staff to sort of, look at this and administer it. And I make the point that even the larger municipalities have had issues administering their TIF districts. And that's something we've seen in some of the audits. And relatedly, the administration costs of both preparing an application and administering the TIF district, as a proportion of the overall investment here, are going to be higher in a mini TIF, because I know for a fact that some of the application costs, if you have it prepared by a consultant, can cost tens of thousands of dollars. Then the town can easily prepare it itself, but it might not be as robust of an application. But you're talking about a $1.5 million project or debt limit here, and the administration costs relative to that size would be a lot higher than the normal TIF program.
Well, I think that was one of the criticisms that the auditor raised, but I thought that was, you're listing that as a con, but I thought in part that's sort of a pro of this bill to minimize some of the administrative burden with this new program. Because, but we can hear more from Megan about that, but you're saying that it may not be worth it administratively, but I thought we were limiting the administrative costs within this bill.
That's a good point. I don't know for sure how much it's going to take to administer a $1.5 million project, or a $1.5 million bond for a single project. But you do still have to prepare an application. You do still have to administer the TIF district. I don't know whether proportionally, whether it's smaller in a small TIF district, or whether it's a sort of a fixed cost for some of these municipalities. Because if it is a fixed cost, this is the point I'm making, is that, if it is a fixed cost, let's say the application is going to cost, $25,000 or something like that for the municipality, because the project's so small, the amount that you spend on administration is going to be higher relative to the current TIF program.
Well, yeah, and I guess I would preview, if we go forward with this bill, that as it came out of our committee last time, I think the limit was much higher than 1.5, and in a political compromise that we made in finance, essentially with ourselves, we lowered it to 1.5 there. But I would venture to say that if we vote something out, we'll probably raise the cap And that would minimize this concern, I think, somewhat. Anyhow, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, that's fair. The next con I'd highlight here is that smaller towns don't have as large or as diversified as a grand list, and don't have as much of diversity of revenue streams as larger towns. And this is important because if your tax increment does not live up to its projection, it's important to have those other sources of revenue to potentially backfill. If you don't want to put it on your property taxpayers, you look at a city like Burlington, you could, if their projection doesn't come, if their increments don't hit their projection, they have, either they can raise their property taxes to cover the bill, or they can rely on other revenue streams to help fill that. Parking revenues, for instance, and they have a property, like an investment property type of tax they have. And that's, I think, relatively important in the scope of TIF districts. If you're a town, you make the decision that we don't want to put any of this on the taxpayer. I'll say that some of these can, yeah.
Is that concern, Graham, a little bit of nanny state in the sense that, we're protecting the towns from themselves. Aren't they the ones that make the decision to go forward, and they're going to have to answer to their taxpayers if the project fails?
In theory, yes, but that's not been the state experience. So generally TIFs have made their projections in Vermont pretty well, so that's a good thing. But there's been the Milton North-South district is an example of a TIF district that sort of struggled to meet its increment. And sort of that's what we see happening in some other states, is you have projects that don't reach their tax increment. Milton North-South experienced that, but what happened there was the state stepped in and the state extended the retention period for that district. And so in theory, the towns have a lot of skin in the game here. If we don't hit our projections, then, we're sort of up a creek, but that's not been the case. Municipalities almost always come to the state. Just think about last year, right? We had a pandemic, building slowed within the TIF districts, and municipalities in theory could have said, well, we signed up for this, this is kind of our issue. But what happened was they came to the legislature and asked for an extension of their debt period. And so I think there is quite a lot of municipalities do have skin in the game, but the experience is that they often come back to the legislature for changes to the program in the event that things come up. And then I've listed out some additional considerations after reading the bill here. And the first is in section 1, the bill puts Bennington and Montpelier TIF districts in sort of the list of existing TIF districts, but I didn't see anywhere where it amended the 6 TIF district limit that was passed, I think, in Act 69 of 2017. So the current statute says that passed in Act 69 was that the cap would be 6 TIF districts, and Bennington and Montpelier have since been created since that act. And so what that means is there's 4 currently available. But what the act does is it looks like it takes Bennington and Montpelier and puts them in the existing, but it doesn't change the 6 part of the statute. And so in effect, it kind of looks like the bill is creating or pushing the cap in an additional 2 districts. So I don't know if that's intentional, but just something, for you all to sort of take a look at, whether you meant to extend it by 2 districts or whether you actually meant to keep it at 6 as it was defined in Act 69, and you might change that number to 4.
We'll ask Becky what our intent was.
The second question I had is, what are the limits on the size of the TIF district? So I remember last year S256, which is the mini TIF bill, had a limit of 10 parcels. And I think at the time last year, I made the point that seemed really small for a TIF district. But I'm just, was thinking about what is the size of these potential districts, just because that would help me put a sense around what the potential fiscal impact could be. And the TIF rule does require that the project have nexus, or the properties that are generating tax increment have nexus with the infrastructure improvement. So I don't necessarily think this is a huge concern, but just something to flag. I don't know whether, it requires discussion, but it might be just a little bit different than the typical TIF program where you have multiple projects around the district. And so the nexus is a little bit, I think, maybe a little easier to define. Whereas let's say you build a wastewater treatment plant in Westford. What is the nexus there? Is it anyone on the line? It just sort of these types of questions that are a little bit ambiguous to me. And this is the final question is really what the one I want to hammer home to legislators, and the one that I hammer home all the time on TIF is TIF the best tool for this purpose? The thing that comes to mind immediately is that the borrowing limit here is very small. 1.5 million, including debt service costs, means you're borrowing about $1.2 million in total capital available for a project. Why is it $1.2 million borrowing capacity for a project is very small, and it's not clear to me why a tool like TIF is necessary for that's TIF is, as I said, more complex than the standard economic development tool. And why is TIF the best tool to achieve a $1.2 million capital injection? And then I make the point here, why, I don't understand, there could be good reasons here, but why isn't just standard municipal borrowing an option here? I've made this hypothetical example for the committee. Imagine you had a town with a grand list of $2.4 million. And let's just assume that grand list is growing at 1.5% per year. And a town borrows 1.25 million, and therefore its total debt service over 20 years is 1.545. So we're talking about, this is the type of borrowing you're talking about in a small town with a $2.4 million grand list. I lay out in the table on the next page what that would cost a $250,000 house in that town. And you're talking about, at the highest point, $84 a year on a $250,000 house. So what is that, $12, $15 a month? And so that's what I'm saying. Typically one of the reasons you might use TIF is to shield your property taxpayers from any property tax increase. Because the debt limit is so small here, I'm having trouble understanding why standard municipal borrowing is not an option here, particularly since the tax increase on a $250,000 home in that community would be, $80 a year. So there may be reasons, I don't know, but this is sort of the analysis that I undertook to sort of figure out what that potential would be, because that's been the traditional way that towns have done development over the years, is through municipal borrowing. They build roads, they borrow for it, they have capital funds for these types of things. So again, the question goes back to, why is TIF the tool here? Is there some other tool that could be used?
Good question.
Yeah, it is a good question, and one we actually talked about when we first discussed this, because it is such a small amount. Would it not be better for us to have particularly a sewer or water fund that we run through institutions that is, yeah, I think your question is really a good one, and one we need to deal with.
Right. Yeah, we will address that one for sure. Senator Brock.
I guess one of the questions is whether or not there's a psychological effect to a property owner, particularly right now, and in the era of COVID, where people are hurting financially. What TIF says is that somebody else is going to pay for this. I don't have to borrow any money, and my property taxes don't have to rise now. I'm going to borrow the money, and somebody else is going to pay for it, because the value of all the properties will rise at some point in the future. And therefore, I can borrow, in effect, interest-free and cost-free. That, to me, is very powerful in terms of an argument as to why people would want to do TIF, particularly in a place like Westford, for example, where they've tried at least once or twice before to do this unsuccessfully through the traditional borrowing route.
Yeah, everybody's right here. And that's why one of the things I think is that the limit, if we're going to pass this, has to go up. Now, Westford's example may be within that 1.5, but that's who we're going to hear from next. Unless people have other questions for Graham, I really appreciate your time, Graham. And I do want to move on to, I guess it's Seth Jansen from Westford, because I want to put a real anecdote on what we're talking about here, because they have been labeled as the poster child for this mini TIF bill, and they've been struggling for a while with it. So, Seth, you're the right person. Am I not correct? Am I correct?
I am. Thank you.
Why don't you introduce
and-
yourself and just take the floor?
Great. So I am Seth Jensen. I am a planning commissioner in the town of Westford. I'm also a member of the Vermont Planners Association because in my day job, I am a professional planner at the Lamoille County Planning Commission. Want to be clear for those of you who know me through that role that I'm testifying here as a local planning commissioner and member of VPA. LCPC hasn't taken a position on this at this point. So some background into how we got into this wastewater discussion in Westford. Westford is also the town that I grew up in. Grew up during the 90s. Went to college and then came back home. Between the time that I was in high school in the 90s, when I graduated from the elementary school, it was the largest class in this town's history. By the time I came home in 2004, like many rural communities, class sizes had started getting smaller. We saw fewer young families settling in town, and older residents were struggling more and more to stay in their rural homes and rural acreages, and found that there were not really any opportunities in town to downsize. That was all exacerbated in 2004 when the mobile home park in town, which had about 30 homes, closed after decades of struggling with its on-site septic system. So essentially overnight, we lost an entire neighborhood in the town because of lack of adequate septic. And the state of Vermont helped soften that blow with a grant from the Vermont Community Development Program to help those folks relocate. But again, because of those housing limitations, most of the folks who lived in the park ended up having to relocate outside of the community. So that also significantly, left a significant decline in the school, and also just, made a lot of people have to relocate to an entire new community. As that happened, we started getting more and more conscious about the limitations in our town center. And I did put together a presentation with some images because I think that's helpful. Is it possible to share those?
Yeah, they're on our website. You sent us 2 documents. Which
Yep.
one? I assume you're going to the project-based TIFs rural wastewater and economic development one.
Yes,
that-
the one, the presentation. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, and
So- I'll walk you through that then. Want to start to the second slide with the image of the Bridge Street main block in Richmond. So my first planning job was actually right out of school in the town of Richmond. So Richmond has a bit of a special place in my heart, not as much as Westford, but still one for helping me getting started and being the reason I could come back to Vermont. So Vermont has this long-standing planning goal about focusing development in our villages and downtowns. A really strong reason for that, or a couple of really strong reasons for that, is that when you have development in those villages and downtowns, it can be denser and more walkable. It can support smaller businesses and more diverse housing options. But all of that is predicated on critical infrastructure like public wastewater and water. So if we jump to the next slide, this is the 1705 property on Route 128, which is the main street through Westford's town center. It is a former bus garage owned and operated by the family that drove students to the school from the early 50s into the late 2010s. However, there is no, the septic system is located under the town office parking lot. It is shared with the town office and town library. The garage is mostly vacant, completely vacant now. The bus yard is also empty. And because of the town's thick clay soils, high groundwater table, there really aren't options for on-site replacement that allow much of anything to be done on the property. I like to tell people that our thick clay soils are good for gardens during drought years, but really not very good for on-site wastewater. And this is a problem that's how our soils are town-wide, with a few exceptions of pockets of sand and gravel. So moving the town center to someplace else doesn't work. The soils are what the soils are in town. So on the 1705 property, the town has been working with the property owner, the Regional Planning Commission, and Green Mountain Habitat for Humanity. And I should also note the River Conservancy, who's looking at the back portion of the property, which butts against the river, about creating a plan for redevelopment. And that would include some new business development for professional office, retail, possibly childcare if some other issues in the demand can be proven, as well as an affordable housing element. So we've worked really hard to adopt a form-based code that streamlines our local regulations and to obtain some of the state designations that would streamline state permitting and the Act 250 process. But really, the number one issue is the wastewater capacity. This is not possible without wastewater. And that is, to give you a picture of how wastewater limits development, pulling from the state wastewater rules, which lay out the capacity demands for different uses. The things you can do with limited wastewater capacity are pretty limited. Dry goods retail can be a possibility, office, warehouse, some light manufacturing. So that's why we are able to continue operating our town office off of that grandfathered system under the parking lot. Adding to that, even office or retail is not really a good idea or really possible to permit. Uses with high wastewater demands, and I'm talking about the capacity, the flow per day. When you're talking about urban systems, you're also talking about the strength of the effluent, leaving that aside for a minute. Things that demand a lot of wastewater capacity are things like any residential use, any kind of housing. Childcare is another big demand, especially if you're providing meals for the kids, which in a rural community where the kids are going to be there all day, you need to provide the meals. It's interesting because when I was pulling this presentation together, I was picking from different pieces of presentations on this issue I've given in the past. And this table came from when I pulled together in 2017 and was really talking then about the barriers that wastewater presents to childcare in rural communities. And with this pandemic, we've really seen that need highlighted even more. But that has been, a major issue for rural towns. Medical offices are another high water use, food preparation.
Seth,
Yep.
this is Senator Sorokin. We're due for a break right around now, but I'd rather have you go on and finish up. Do you think you could finish up in about 10 minutes?
I can definitely. Yeah.
Okay,
So,
thank you.
I guess what I will do, since you have the presentation, is I will let you review some of the background on wastewater and jump specifically to the piece on TIFs. So I'm going to jump to the 10th slide then, just to highlight an issue that the state auditor identified in a report back in 2018. This shows state and local infrastructure spending per capita. Vermont is in the lower 10. So there is a volume issue there in terms of funding and financing available. But just as importantly is the ability for towns at the Vermont scale to access that funding. And so getting into the next set of slides 11, I guess I want to use the rest of my time to talk about gaps in the funding streams. So big gap for towns that you've already talked about is that most of the funding streams are loan-based. Because most rural towns don't have local options taxes, that means we rely on local property taxes or user fees. Both property taxes and user fees are considered housing costs when you're classifying affordability. And a statistic in Westford and a very real issue is, when you get into the details, our renters especially are very cost burdened. And all of our rental housing, which is limited, and I want to be really clear, it's very limited compared to bigger communities, is in this service area. Most of the success stories in Vermont of wastewater systems at our town scale have received substantial supplemental grant funds. So one of the reasons TIFs are valuable is they provide a tool for bond repayment that is separated from existing housing costs. And that term, existing housing costs, keep that in your head, please. So another major issue with the existing funding streams is that there's not a clear tool for offsetting costs associated with capacity for new development on existing users. And actually the EPA guidance on financing wastewater systems points this out, is that if you're planning for future growth needs, you should identify some source of additional revenue other than user fees and existing tax assessments. So TIFs, again, fill that void in a way that is directly tied to new development and in a way that really encourages the town to plan ahead of how this investment in infrastructure is going to lead to new development. So I provided in the next slide on slide 13, just an example of this. I understand we don't have time to go through this entirely, but what this shows is that about 20% of the capacity of the system we're planning would be available for future economic development. We're hoping to increase that number by including pre-treatment, which could increase that significantly, also increase the cost. So a benefit of TIF would be we'd be able to create more capacity for more housing, more jobs, more incremental growth, without putting a huge new burden on the existing users or the existing property taxpayers. And something I really do think about the people in the rental housing. The property owners have done a really good job maintaining those buildings with affordable rents, but that's really difficult. And the septic, systems represent a vulnerability to that we experienced. What we don't want to do is significantly increase the housing costs for existing folks in town in order to create new housing. It's this catch-22 we're stuck in that TIF really, really helps with. So again, just to think about from the local perspective, you know, those housing needs, the need for jobs, the need for businesses like childcare, people in town need them, the state needs them as well. With a purely loan-based model, the municipality is doing 100% of payback, but a significant portion of the property tax revenues go to the state education fund, which is justifiable. My mother's a teacher's aide, completely understand the value of statewide investment in education. New businesses, sales tax revenue, income revenue, all go to the state and federal government. As a small town, you know, we don't have access to local options taxes like larger communities do. So the project-based TIF creates some sharing of those new state property tax revenues, but specifically to fund the infrastructure. So there's a clear tie to the investment and return on the investment. And while I know this is harder to measure than the new property tax investment, when we're creating new businesses or bringing new residents into the community, there's also income in terms of other revenue streams that help support the general fund. So our existing funds, and I promise I'll be quick with this, the Clean Water Revolving Loan Fund currently is the state's primary way for funding wastewater. As its name implies, it is focused on environmental mitigation. Again, a legitimate investment, but not a tool that's designed for economic development and housing. So the systems it has in place for awarding grant funds are really are based on things like failing systems or straight pipes. ANR has been really proactive about working with rural communities on things like principal forgiveness for both planning, engineering, and ultimately, hopefully, implementation. But that's still really focused on the existing user base. There are some funding streams through USDA and CDBG that do provide grant assistance. That grant assistance, again, is based on the median income of existing users. So two problems with that. The first is that housing cost is a function of cumulative cost, or housing affordability is a function of both cumulative costs and income. The other issue is that if you have a village, and in some ways our village is like this, where you have some bifurcation of incomes occurring, where you have more affluent owners and less affluent renters, and the renters are in the minority, the median income does not necessarily reflect their reality. We have had discussions with the community development block grant folks at ACCD about trying to access those funds to establish a sliding scale for user fees or to target for the rental housing. And there's really not a good way right now to do that. And then again, the other issue is it doesn't account for future low moderate income housing, which in our case, we really want to fill that void, or at least partially, that was left with the closure of the mobile home park, so that there are opportunities for affordable both rental housing and home ownership, which is why we're having our conversations with Green Mountain Habitat for Humanity. And so the way this program is structured, we view as an opportunity to create new affordable housing in a greater number of communities and hopefully prevent further stratification, both within the community, but even among communities. Because what we are seeing in rural towns is some rural towns are gentrifying, where residents of modest means are having a harder and harder time staying in them. And then other rural towns are experiencing disinvestment and decline. And both of those are hollowing out a big part of what has traditionally made rural Vermont rural Vermont. So though that's the story in a nutshell. VPA has some kind of
Steph,
detailed type
can I ask-
questions, but yeah, go ahead.
Can I ask you, you've laid out all the impediments for alternative financing for this. Has there actually been steps taken or numerous attempts to get financing for this wastewater improvement in Westford?
Sure, I'm happy to talk about that and
Very,
the process.
very briefly.
Yeah, because all we heard about was the bond vote.
Okay, so we have been taking steps we secured a piece of property which has the golden soil, as I call it. We've been doing the planning and engineering. Our select board has been very cautious about going to a bond vote without having a sense of repayment that isn't 100% on the property taxpayers. So at this point, we have not had a failed bond vote, but we have had failed attempts to move sort of a bond beyond that point because residents have raised legitimate questions about the cost. So the costs in that sheet that I showed you assume a 50% loan forgiveness. They jump to user fees of like $2,000 without any kind of loan forgiveness, and property tax increases of like $80 for general town users. So that is where we stand. Other towns in our situation have faced bond failures.
Okay. So we'll hear more from Megan. I remember she made a very good presentation, or somebody did last year, about the potential, in addition to the impact on rents and affordability, just what the downtown of Westford is envisioned to look like once this wastewater project, if it ever is completed. But we need to take a 10-minute break. Let's make it 5 to 10:50. And I want to hear from, I guess it's Brian Carpenter, very briefly about Middlebury's situation, so we can round out the anecdotal stories around the need here. So we'll be back in 5 minutes and we'll plow forward till 11:30. Thank you.